everybody. Good afternoon, good day, wherever and whenever you are. As Peter has said, my name is Jason Lane. I'm the current president of the International Association of Gaming Regulators, IAGA. It's my pleasure to moderate this regulators panel on the use of AI in the gambling industry. Before we start, I just want to give a thank to the International Gaming Standards Association for putting these two webinars together. We agreed a collaborative partnership with the IGSA back in October 2020, and I think it's fair to say that although the pandemic has held us back somewhat, I'd like to think that these webinars are a new beginning of what we can achieve. So I can say I've certainly enjoyed the first panel. I think Tim and Stacey's presentations will be a hard act to follow, particularly with the not just the entertainment, but the enthusiasm and the depth of knowledge. I'm going to give you a confession. I'm certainly not speaking for my distinguished panelists here, but I am by no means a tech expert, but I'd like to hope that I'm a half-decent regulator, and I've got some idea of what government and the public interest is all about. So, hey, looking at AI, AI in the gambling industry is obviously promising. It's going to be great for operators. It develops their loyalty, marketing, risk management, and their operational controls. But will AI also be equally as good for the players themselves? And importantly, how will regulators keep up with the use of this technology, given the clear room for exploitation that it offers to unscrupulous operators? And I think Tim gave us a little insight into that. So I'm privileged today to be joined by an excellent panel of regulators from across 3 continents. We did hope to bring in a 4th, but sadly with time zones, somebody was going to have to get up in the middle of the night. So we've settled for 3, but 6 jurisdictions from 3 continents, I think, is an excellent representation of IAGA membership. And so, gentlemen, if I could ask you to introduce yourselves and your jurisdictions, please.
I'm first up. So I'm Brent Mccurdy. I am the Deputy Chief Operating Officer of the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario in Canada. We have a really broad mandate in gaming, of course, but also we regulate in liquor and cannabis and horse racing as well. And in the gaming sector, we have had a long history with charitable gaming and with casinos and land-based offerings, but and we've had a domestic internet gaming offering for quite some time as well. But a lot of my time has been spent over the last couple of years trying to stand up a new competitive internet gambling marketplace in Ontario. So set to launch shortly. So this is a really interesting topic for me, and I'm also by no means a technology expert, but we've been thinking about a lot of the impacts of data and all the way up to AI in our regulatory approach as we go into this new world. Thanks for having me.
Dennis, you up next?
Can you hear me? I'm Dennis. I'm from the National Gambling Board in South Africa. Those who know South Africa, they know that we've got about 9 provinces, which means 9 pieces of legislation that you have to live with in the gambling industry. So our industry is very heavily regulated, but we do notice that with the advent of technology, especially the bookmaking industry, you'll find that a lot of the offerings are now online, which means that you can't really talk much about geographical boundaries per se, but in terms of the online gambling in general, is still very much illegal in South Africa, although there is online betting that's allowed, and there's some very interesting products that are coming in the online betting space, which are making us to raise some eyebrows. So I'm glad to be part of this panel, and I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. Thank you.
James, you up next?
Hi everyone. Yeah, my name's James Green. I'm the Director of Data at the Gambling Commission in the UK. We regulate land-based and online gambling in Great Britain, and we also cover national lottery as well. In the Gambling Commission, my responsibilities cover the Commission's internal use of data, but increasingly our policies on how licensees use data, for example, how to identify consumers at risk of gambling-related harm. I'm a former director of the Gaming Regulators European Forum, and I'm currently chair of IAGA's Statistics Committee. So, like Jason, not a technology expert, but here to input on AI and how it applies to regulation.
Fantastic, thank you. And Phil.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Phil Katsaris. I'm a board member with the Nevada Gaming Control Board. I should say good morning, good evening, depending on where you're at. The Nevada Gaming Control Board, as you might know, regulates all gambling activities within the state of Nevada. We are primarily a brick and mortar market. A lot of people think it's Las Vegas. I can gamble on whatever I want. Actually, you can't. We've got brick and mortar. We have peer-to-peer online poker. We of course have sports betting. We don't have a lottery, and we don't have online casino gaming. We have a team of 400 staff members that work for the organization, regulating approximately 2,400 different locations. And that goes from, it spans the spectrum of casinos on the Las Vegas Strip, all the way down to your bar, restaurant, all the way down to maybe a C-store, a 7-Eleven that might have a couple of slot machines. So thank you very much for having me here today.
Great, thank you, everybody. Just a quick word for you, Peter. If Anders joins us, maybe he's delayed, or I think the session started a little earlier than he might have thought. So if he turns up, hopefully just drop him straight into the discussion for me. And the first area I think we're going to look at is the issue of ethics. So following on from what Tim was saying, the benefits of AI use are clear. It's going to allow and does allow gambling companies to monitor and track their customers' gambling behavior in real time. It can help with the early detection of harmful gambling behavior, and it can strengthen intervention strategies in support of safer gambling, harm reduction, and prevention. But the deployment of AI relies on the use of personal data, which also brings into play questions around ethics and customer and consumer privacy. So while operators may say the use of AI is actually smart business practice, and customers are likely to be incentivized to play more, will players actually even know that what they're seeing is a consequence of the data logging of their previous play? Is it enough to add this to terms and conditions, considering I suspect most customers don't actually read the terms and conditionings they're signing up to? Particularly in Europe, but in other jurisdictions, we have increasing data privacy laws, GDPR, which implies the use of informed consent. How is the gaming industry going to get informed consent from their clientele? And I don't even want to touch on Tim's description of deep fakes. I mean, that is a bit frightening. Maybe we'll get onto that. But James, if you'd like to kick off, how are we going to ensure the ethical use of AI? And will the power of AI, particularly in marketing and advertising, inevitably come at the expense of ethics?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And what a great question to kick off with. As regulators, ethics are, of course, a key concern for us. Oh, sorry, the sun suddenly came out down here. And AI, as we've seen, it's got real potential to transform how gambling operators provide gambling products and services, and the opportunity for growth and innovation that brings. But of course, it also brings challenges. I think most of the regulators, like the Gambling Commission in Great Britain, will have in their remit objectives for ensuring responsible gambling or safer gambling. And we're tasked to protect the safety, the security, the choices, the rights of gambling consumers. So artificial intelligence, if it's used unethically, either deliberately or accidentally, could harm consumers, and therefore it's very much, as you covered there, a topic that we really need to engage with. What might unethical use of AI look like? Well, Tim's given us some great examples there. An unethical AI system could be biased, it could be discriminatory. It could use, as you mentioned there, Jason, it could use our personal data illegally or in a way that invades our privacy. And of course, machine-based decisions might not be transparent. And so who's accountable for those decisions? If the computer says no, what sort of recourse have we got to that decision? And it's at its simplest level, a badly constructed AI system could just be making bad decisions or unsafe decisions or wrong decisions. So in a gambling context, of course, while AI offers that real potential to predict individuals at risk of problem gambling or identify money laundering, there's also the potential that it could be applied to the game logic to get a player to chase their losses or to rig a game. So to answer the question directly, how do we ensure ethical use of AI? To me, we need to regulate it. We need to regulate both the development of it and the use of AI. And I think that starts with establishing standards, either at the international, national, or at industry level for the ethical development and deployment of AI. And then regulators, whether it's the gambling regulator or whoever's space AI falls into, regulators need to mandate those standards and mandate that they're adopted and followed, and aligned with that, a regulatory regime that ensures compliance with those standards. So that's the simple view. I think it's more nuanced than that, and I think AI is not a black and white, a binary. Well, it is a very binary topic, isn't it? But it's from a regulatory approach. You know, we need to create a dialogue around AI ethics, and around the safety of AI. It's an evolving technology. No one has all the answers. So I think we need to create space for dialogue, separate from the sort of set the standards and regulate against the standards. Let's create that space as well, where we can talk with software developers, with operators about how they want to use AI, perhaps create things like regulatory sandboxes where AI approaches can be developed and evaluated, and evaluate those approaches, recognize best practice, share best practice, and just keep that dialogue going. I'll stop there and see if any of the other panelists have any other views on how to ensure ethical use of AI, and I suppose particularly around the marketing and the advertising.
I'm waiting for a volunteer. Oh,
I'll jump in here. I didn't know if we were going in order, just a roundtable. No, I mean, you've got a lot of great thoughts there, James. I come from my previous role. I was running a company in North America where we were delivering system solutions for the brick and mortar operations. What we would always like to try to fancy ourselves as trying to provide that online data in a brick and mortar world. And what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of what James is saying is understanding your players and what actually makes them tick, and encourage them to engage. Well, greater player engagement, encourage those players to continually engage with the product. What's that product? Well, that product is gaming, and to a larger extent, just that brand as well. And so we were deploying certain levels of AI as well, and very data intensive. And one thing you just mentioned there was the software developers. That's one piece that I think gets lost sometimes, is that when regulators are talking to the companies, they're talking to the mouthpieces, the senior executives, without actually understanding the nuts and bolts of how that software is being implemented and how it's trying to target those players specifically. Because at the end, from a regulator's standpoint, yes, we understand these businesses are there to generate revenues. They're entertainment options for their players. But as regulators, we need to make sure we've got proper implementation of guardrails and frameworks that these companies need to abide by, such that they don't get into that realm of, yes, now we are acting unethically. And so there's some boilerplate things that we do right now. Implementation of velocity controls, responsible gaming limits, of course, prohibitions against targeting those who've already decided that I don't want to gamble anymore. Please don't target me anymore. in trying to induce those players who clearly have a problem, right? It's those folks are more easily identifiable because they've self-excluded themselves. It's those others that have not yet done that, but they keep going down that path of destruction, of continually gaming and not even realizing perhaps, or if they do, they just don't know how to solve that problem. And on the other hand, you have the artificial intelligence trying to engage them, saying, no, continue on with this behavior. So it's our responsibility as regulators to step in to find out where that point must be. And I'm a big proponent of self-imposed mandated or self-imposed limits, so that those limits are available, and having numerous levels of those limits so that players can decide what those limits might need to be. But there's, of course, markets all over the world that say, no, we're going to go further than that. It's going to be a government mandated limit as to what that number might be. And I think a lot of that depends upon the marketplace that you're in.
I'm just going to throw in an idea. I hope it tunes to some of our IGSA audience here, but, picking up on what you've both been saying, is it for us engaging with government to mandate the standards that the industry is going to have to operate to? Particularly for me, is scale an issue? Because one of the things, that is great about my jurisdiction, we're a very, very small jurisdiction. It allows us, I think, a deeper relationship with our licensees, just because we have relatively few of them, right? Which in Nevada, in the UK, and probably the same in South Africa and Canada, is just not realistic for you. Is the scale of the industry that you're regulating makes the use of AI and the ethics of AI overly problematic, or is it something we should embrace and look to influence so that it's embedded in the development, because we're pushing out the standard that they're going to have to use? So do any of you have any feel about whether scale of the size of the industry is an issue here?
Maybe I'll jump in. I think it's interesting to think about, the role government plays here. Of course, technology is going to play an increasing role in the gambling industry. That's I think obvious, and they're going to be using this technology to try to make profits. That's kind of obvious as well. But I mean, that same technology can be used to try to drive to the regulatory outcomes that we're looking for as well. That technology that can identify VIPs can also help to identify people who are potentially at higher risk of gambling harms. And I think it's incumbent on us to set that environment to ensure that the technology that is being used for the regulatory good, as well as the business interests of these organizations. So I think that the scale piece is interesting, because I think that it probably will lead to quicker development on these things, because there's just more big companies doing this work. But setting out those expectations, getting them to harness their power to meet our expectations, and ensuring that we're doing the sufficient regulatory assurance activities to monitor, to make sure that they're actually doing those things, asking for targeted data in areas so we can see their behavior. What are the outcomes they're actually getting to? How many people are they identifying as at high acute risk, and how are they intervening in those cases? I think there's a lot of power in the data that regulators can use in a targeted way, not necessarily by creating their own AI approach, but in actually seeing how these entities are acting, when they're actually interacting with players.
And Dennis, to bring you in, you mentioned that South Africa internet gaming isn't legal yet. Do you think the issue of ethics from a jurisdictional perspective is different in South Africa or in other jurisdictions? One of the things I'm sure we've all heard through our careers is the industry crying out that we've all got different standards in different jurisdictions. Do you think there's any ethical pieces which are particular to your jurisdiction as opposed to any other, or do you think they're fairly common piece, you know, and all human societies are intrinsically the same? What's your South African experience?
I think the issue of ethics is pretty much universal. I wouldn't say that South Africa has different ethics standards compared to the rest of the world. I indicated that, you know, we've got 9 different provinces, and each and every province has got its own jurisdiction, so to say. So you do find, you know, the application of or the determination of what's ethical and what's not ethical may differ slightly from province to province based on particular scenarios that they consider in those provinces. But overall, I think we are following pretty much similar standards in the rest of the country. I talked about you know, the online sports betting, for example. There are some products which are not allowed in other provinces, and others which are in other provinces. They don't see any problems with those kind of products. I think it's more of what is legally acceptable rather than what is ethical in that situation. However, some of the products you might think, you know, there are ethical considerations which you don't quite understand in that regard. But as a country, the country as a whole, I think we have pretty much similar standards across the entire world.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, before we wrap this session up, if we're going to establish standards and regulate them, as James started and you've all discussed, who's doing this? Again, going back to my point that, you know, the industry complain, we go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, we can't use the same forms, we can't apply the same machines, we can't do what we've done before. And, you know, you, Mr. Regulator or Ms. Regulator, you're costing me a hell of a lot of money. You know, is there any burning desire in the regulatory world to try and harmonize these standards? It's well, as we've heard, it's actually not such a new industry, but, you know, it's got exponential growth. There's going to be a next new thing in AI. Do we want to get ahead of the curve and work with industry, work with the IGSA to try and set those standards? Come on, who's going to be brave?
Jason, I'll just give a piece from the UK, but currently the regulation of AI as a sector-led approach, although the government is currently reviewing that, and we may go to a sort of national regulation of AI. And then, of course, so the gambling regulator, the Gambling Commission has a role then to regulate AI use by gambling operators. And as you said, when we talk about scale, we're a relatively small organisation. We'll want to reach out to others, whether that's other international partners or other UK regulators, to get help with that, because otherwise that's a lot of work to build up the capability and capacity to be able to generate standards that are required. So I think from a UK perspective, yeah, we're very open to working with a range of people on the standards, and then if national standards come, or standards from other regulatory, but if other regulators in the UK have to regulate the AI space, there'll always be a gambling component to that. So again, yeah, we'd be keen to work with others to look at that gambling element.
Okay, great, thanks. Phil, you were going to say something, or Dennis?
Yes, I wanted to say, in the gambling industry, by its very nature, each and every single country has got its own set of standards that they would like to regulate. So there is an element of difficulty in terms of trying to work together, different countries working together to try and regulate a particular technology. Like, for example, in South Africa, we don't regulate technology at all. We do have a set of standards, but you can bring whatever technology as long as you satisfy the standards, then you're good to go. So in terms of regulating AI, we don't really have a particular policy in that regard at the moment, but there is a case to be made because we do know that technology is advancing so fast that we need to start working differently in order to at least be with the curve, if not ahead. So there is a case to be made, but I'm not really sure how practical that is at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Jason, I was just gonna say that yes, a certain level of harmonization would be most welcome. I certainly would agree with that, but you really got to start with the baseline, right? The boilerplate type of criteria to start from, because complete harmonization would never occur, right? It's just too much of there's too many moving parts in all the various jurisdictions around the world. I mean, just Nevada agreeing with, domestically on these types of policies throughout the states would be very difficult. We're like 50 different states here, particularly when it comes to gambling. We are 50 different states here. But yeah, I would welcome a level of harmonization, but it's finding that baseline where everybody can agree on some of these things that are not controversial. I think somebody in the last session, or perhaps it was this one, we were talking about opt-in requirements. I would hope that would be something that is a boilerplate type of condition that everybody would agree on. That as a player, I have the ability to opt in. Informed consent, like you guys were talking about with GDPR, that should be a baseline understanding with all players, that they have the ability to say, hey, I don't want to be targeted in this manner, or yeah, no, I want these marketing promotions sent my way.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments before Anders? Welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Anders Basvold from the Danish Gambling Authority. I'm sorry, I think I had a program that said 5:15 to 6:15, so apologies. I thought I was in really good time. But to this last point, I think it's important that machine learning, AI or machine learning more broadly, is just a tool that can do things a little better than what is already done. So targeted marketing is not something new. It is already there. It will continue to happen. So we more view it as a tool that can be used. It has some opportunity, but not as a paradigm shift here. That means all regulation must be changed. And in the same way, we can do something better with AI. So we will do that.
And Brent, did you want to jump in?
Just on the idea of harmonization, we've just gone through a very rigorous process to create new internet gaming standards over the last year, and we did really work with some of our partner regulators. We leaned heavily on the UK standards, and places like New Jersey and Denmark and other places. I think there's a bit of a convergence, at least in that area, in some of the standards. I mean, how we actually operationalize our approaches, I think, is another matter. Some regulators ask for currently, a lot of data from operators in the iGaming space, and some ask for more targeted. So I think there's a lot of areas we can learn from each other and try to figure out how to be reduce burden on industry, but be increasingly effective. So we definitely welcome that as well. But I think, as Phil is saying, it's we should maybe manage our expectations, but have a lot of ambition.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a nice segue into the next topic we're going to discuss. And following on from Phil's notion that we need to have a baseline, let's turn to an issue that should sit at the center of effective regulation. And of course, that's responsible gambling. Will AI make it easier to identify markers of as I'm sure you know, AI learns by extracting information from people's spoken and written words and actions via the use of algorithms. And because machines will soon learn much faster than humans, bots are continually developed to provide a better tailored customer experience. Operators have been keen to point out that this increased knowledge about their customers will also help protect them by flagging up early indications of irresponsible play and allowing for quicker and earlier interventions. However, algorithms are subjective, and they're only as good as the people who created them. And since human societies have structural biases and inequalities, maybe machine learning tools will inevitably learn those problems too. So Anders, if I could ask you to kick off the next topic, what should regulators expect from their licensees to prove that their use of AI and machine learning is also in the interests of their players, and particularly responsible gambling?
Yeah, I think with the marketing thing, they can use it and they will target, and that will probably be efficient. We see that as a tool that doesn't really raise that many new questions. But on the player protection, we think there are great opportunities to see, can we predict that this player will get a problem? I mean, if we, for instance, can predict this player will self-exclude, then it would be nice to catch this person a month before they would self-exclude, for instance, or something like that. So I think everybody can try and look at the data and see to what degree can we predict dangerous gambling, so we can try to help people at an earlier stage. And you're absolutely right about the prejudice. So it's important to know with AI, I think, and all kind of machine learning, that the result will never be better than the original test set. So if you have whatever you have based on to say this is dangerous, this is not dangerous, the machine will only be able to replicate what you would conclude. But you can do something like scrambling, and we ask for that. You can scramble sex and age or other things that you think the machine shouldn't look at. That's easier for a machine to disregard than maybe for humans sometimes. So I think there's also you need to set the guidelines, but it is possible also to get rid of some of the prejudice.
Who'd like to come in next?
If I may, I think everybody understands that casinos are there to make money. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So when you talk of responsible gambling, and when they say they'll be able to detect elements of problem gambling, that sort of seem to go against what they're trying to achieve, because the more money the person spends, the more money they make. So that's a bit of a difficult thing to understand. However, if we're saying that we're going to be identifying people and then try to see if they've got elements of problem gambling, or if they're developing into problem gamblers, one thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do with that information? In South Africa, for example, we have self-exclusion, but we don't have forced exclusion. So if you're not going to exclude the person, what are you going to do with that information? How are you going to entice the person to stop gambling? Because that's going to be very difficult. I mean, I think if you try to talk to someone who's sort of addicted to gambling and trying to convince them to stop gambling, you would understand how difficult a job that is. So unless we have a program that we say this is effective, is going to make a person to stop or to self-exclude, I don't really get the point why you want to identify early if a person can develop into to become a problem gambler. So that's a difficult one for me to understand, and I'm not really sure if customers can be able to convince me of that.
Okay, I guess the cynical person would say that the operator, for their license conditions and ethics, if nothing else, and their business reputation, wants to make sure that the data that they receive shows a customer who, on the one hand, is perhaps showing behavior that's indicative of possible irresponsible play, but on the other hand, their marketing people are saying, hey, this person could be a VIP. How do we make sure that the data that's coming through goes down the right path and is interpreted in the right way? And how can we use the AI to make our jobs easier as regulators? Because we don't have the capacity to go through all of these transactions. And there have been lots and lots of examples in the past couple of years of companies that have made use of people's irresponsible play to boost profits. How can we make sure that this technology is not used in that way?
So I think that it's obviously a bit of a difficult question because, you know, the VIP at-risk player dichotomy is obviously, I think, pretty real, and there are incentives, obviously, to try to draw those people in to become to spend more money. But, you know, I think that gambling operators actually are being more and more incentivized to be careful with that that kind of, you know, dichotomy, and to start to show that they're acting in responsible ways with those people. And I think that using technology to try to identify where people, you know, better and better risk profiles of people to try to figure out what their baseline is and when they're experiencing maybe acute aspects of harm, and then operators taking an accountability to nudge that person, or to even cut them off in some situations if they're really showing signs of experiencing significant harm or risk of serious harm. You know, I think we as regulators have to require them to do that stuff, to turn their minds to what people to what the data is showing them, and then to act appropriately and connect our activities to make sure that they are actually doing those things, because, you know, they're incentivized to be seen as responsible actors in this space insofar as they have to. But, you know, we need to look deeper to see if they are following through with those things. So I think that's where it's our role to step in and figure out ways to monitor, to ensure that they're using the technology in an appropriate way to identify those really difficult cases that might come up.
Okay, panelists, just generally, I mean, do you think that your experience in your jurisdictions is that operators are moving in that right direction? Do we need more mandatory safeguards, or can we generally say, as I think we would like to hope, that most of the industry is ethical, that they can make a reasonable return on what they're doing without being exploitative? You know, how are we moving? Anders?
Yeah, I think as other things with AI, it's not new. The companies have also been able to call their high spending customers before AI and see if they can get them to spend more. We have done that in Denmark, that we simply have now a duty of attention. That means that the operators have an obligation to look at the gambling patterns of their customers and help them to address their problems if they have any with gambling. So we both do that we try to see their procedures, ask them what they do, what parameters they use, and that kind of thing. And we also try to do, it's a project work in progress, but we also try to do it with data ourselves that we have, and try and see how easy is it to look from the pattern and see, can we also predict things, so we know kind of how difficult is it for the operators to actually spot something. So I think it's something where we need to join forces, all of us, and learn. And hopefully also for the operators, they have this also the benefit that if they can keep a customer from playing too much, then maybe they can keep them for a longer time too. So it's not necessarily that is always the best for the operator that they spend as much as possible. And also that it can be used for marketing. How they protect their players could also be a force in the competition, I guess. But I guess all of us must work together and try to find out how best to protect the players.
Anyone else like to pitch in before we move on? Okay, let's move on. From a regulator's perspective, there are a whole host of challenges faced by the use of AI. It presents a range of different transparency challenges. One of the most important for me, and I don't mind admitting it, is the total lack of explainability of how machine learning algorithms actually work. And I think this is one of the things that Stacey touched upon in her presentation. You know, how does their internal decision-making logic work that can be explained in a way that an ordinary human being, like to think I'm an ordinary human being, would understand. And I certainly wouldn't have a clue where to start. So can we trust that if we don't understand it? And how much independence of action do we give AI to make the right choice and avoid the syndrome of, computer says no, when humans can perceive emotional stimuli based on lived experience? And going back to Tim's presentation, I was impressed to see, of course, computers and AI actually now can take account of emotional stimulus. But, do we know whether we're dealing with a person or a bot over the internet? Does it matter? Brent, if you could start us off on this one, what are the biggest issues preventing regulators from using AI? Is it data access, privacy, cost, or just managing the sheer scale of everything that's going on?
Thanks. The one thing I'll say is that the adoption of AI by regulators, I think, is going to be limited by resources. I just don't think that we can think that we're going to have the same capabilities as these multi-billion-dollar organizations that are using this for targeting individuals to make a lot of their revenue from. So, I don't think that that's going to really be a realistic proposition. But I mean, it doesn't mean that we can't use AI for regulatory purposes and develop some of those capabilities. Our organization, for instance, has been working on a business intelligence approach for the last around a decade now. And we've had some very interesting results. The team's done things like, teach a computer to read text and find names and make connections between people to understand potential money laundering schemes in land-based casinos. They've done algorithms to determine the likelihood of, or using the past history of horse racing to understand how a horse is likely going to end up in a race, and if they do much better, we may target those horses for testing for potential drug performance enhancing drugs. Whereas in the past, what we would have done is just always test the top 3 horses. So we've developed some of these capabilities. They're targeted. We're figuring out ways to use it to direct our resources in a more evidence-based manner, but it's a far cry from creating full-on AI algorithms and that sort of thing. But we're becoming more and more literate with this stuff over time. Regulators have to be careful, I think, and I'm not an expert on this, but they have to be careful with, or at least thoughtful with, the use of technology. So you mentioned this idea of transparency, black box type algorithms. If regulators are using these sorts of technologies for the foundation of compliance and ultimately enforcement actions that are going to end up in courts, then I think that would be a tricky litigation proposition that we're going to have to think through, how we'd use that if we actually were using those technologies. And I think there's also like a really real regulatory burden kind of trade-off discussion here to be had that limits regulatory ability to really be in this space. So you can ask for piles and piles and piles of data from these companies that are creating more and more of it. You can try and develop these capabilities to keep up with them. It's going to cost a ton of money and effort on both sides. And I think that some jurisdictions have tried that, and some, I think, mixed results. I think there's also, so we have to think about what's our impact in the use of data, what's our capabilities, and what are we actually asking for to assure ourselves that things are being done properly within our regulations. And then, as I said a couple of times, trying to harness the use of the private sector's use of AI and making sure that it's used within for the things that we want to see out there for trying to curb the responsible gambling risks and to try to combat money laundering and that sort of thing. So I think there's a space for regulators using AI and this sort of technology, and I just don't think it's going to be in developing the full-on types of cases that are being used by the sector.
Okay, thanks. It's a shame Phil's had to leave us, but I was going to say that Nevada is one of those agencies that does seem to have unlimited resources and its own testing labs and everything else. I mean, do any of the other members of the panel think that their jurisdictions, either internally or interagency or across their jurisdiction, or hell, I'll even give a big plug, of course, for IAGA. This is a piece of work that I think we'd be very happy to take on and try and develop. But do any of you guys in your jurisdictions think this is something you could tackle on your own?
Jason, I'll chip in from a UK perspective. I think there are obvious barriers to AI, and things like data privacy need working through, etc. But as Brent just mentioned, you can scale. It's relatively simple with low investment to start off with something and then build from there. So I think we can all adopt and use AI with limited resources. But what I would say is the four key barriers or things that need solving from a UK perspective, at least, is funding to scale up, data, so access to the big data that's needed to apply AI to. So as a regulator, we don't hold a huge data warehouse. Obviously, there's lots of data with the gambling companies. We don't have that. Now we can request data. We've got power to request data, but we haven't got those live feeds or the volume of feeds or the range of data that would qualify as big data. So access and getting that data would be key to us. That brings its own challenges because, of course, across the gambling industry, or at least in the gambling industry in the UK, there's no data standards. Different operators define things differently, so that makes it complicated when drawing in the data. The third thing, I think, from a UK perspective is that skills internally, the skills to work with AI. When we start talking about data science skills, that becomes that's an expensive skill to buy in and a scarce resource. And as a public sector regulator, we're probably not paying the salaries that will compete with others for that skill set. And then the final one is that really the compute power. Once we've got the data, we then need to upscale our systems to be able to store it, manage it, process it. So there's an investment there. So I think those are the four things: funding, access to data, skills, and compute. But of course, I think if we had all that in place, I think there's then a knock-on that suddenly, if we can identify non-compliance on a mass scale or problem gambling on a mass scale, then what do we do with that data? Suddenly that sort of lends itself to, we need to transform other parts of the business. So suddenly our compliance function might need to be exponentially expanded to deal with the insights and that's coming out of the AI work. So we can start small, but it could get very large, and as a smallish regulator, it could get quite unwieldy. Just some thoughts on the UK.
I smile at your use of the term small regulator from my jurisdiction's perspective, but anyway, yeah, no, I really take your point in relation to the computing and actual processing of the data. One of the things I always say to my team is, why are we collecting this stuff from our operators? What is the purpose? What are you going to do with it? And if what you're going to do with it is go, hey, this is really great, and stick it over here, you're wasting everybody's time. You're wasting the operator's time. You're wasting our time. It's doing no good for social responsibility, taxation, or any other purpose that you thought you might be collecting it for. Whoop, come in. So I think we need to be really targeted on what data we ask for and really know what we're going to do with it from a policy perspective. Anders?
We have a lot of data. We get data from in near real time for our companies. For instance, for betting, we get the stakes, and then later the wins, and also an identifier of the player. We cannot identify who it is, but just that it's the same player that played this, that played that, for instance. So we have a lot of data, and we do and will, or at least we will use AI. I think more than a lot of investment in software, that is getting more and more off the shelf to have reasonable products for this. But I think you need also internally some people who can, I would say, interpret the data, what the machine delivers, what it can be used for and what it can't. So you need some people with some skills in understanding the results, I guess. And it's good to know kind of what the machine is doing, even though you don't replicate it, but just what are the basic principles. I think that is healthy. And if I may just add on the explainability that you pointed out before, which is absolutely true. But if you don't have too many parameters, you can scramble one of them. And then if you get considerably worse results, then you know it was an important parameter that you took out, for instance. So in that kind of sense, you can kind of afterwards get some results out of the machine of what was important. But the dilemma is right. It's harder to explain the better the machine is.
Okay, we are nearly coming up on our time. I just want to squeeze in really quickly, and I'm not expecting a big amount of discussion, but maybe 30 seconds per participant if you'd like. Social values change. AI will need to change and adapt. Can we expect that the AI that we have asked to respect autonomy, privacy, the values of now are going to be good for the present? One of the issues I find with regulation, and I'm guilty of this, is we like regulation to kind of stay static because we get to know it, we're comfortable with it, we know what we're doing. Don't really like evolution, because evolution means more hard work and doing things differently, and maybe regulators are not as typically exciting and dynamic as they find in industry. We really are, of course. Any final thoughts, starting with Dennis, and how regulators keep up with the industry and keep up with change before we wrap up?
I think it's very important that regulators they start to recognize that we have to be tech savvy. We have to really understand what's coming our way, because the developers of AI, they'll tell you that, okay, well, after feeding in the first set of data, they've got pretty good idea how the AI is going to arrive at a conclusion, and they can even predict what sort of conclusion that is going to arrive at. But the more data that you feed in, the more you are unable to figure out how it's arriving at that data, because it's busy, updating itself, with the new information. The reasoning changes depending on the type of data that it's getting. So it's very hard to say we will be able to predict in the long term how decisions are going to be arrived at, and what sort of decisions are going to be taken. So there is an element of fear that we should live with in terms of whether AI is going to be good in the long term or not. Just based on the fact that we don't really know if it's going to arrive at the decisions that it's arriving at now with this kind of data in the long term.
Okay, thank you. So guys, am I being a bit too cynical? Am I too old-fashioned, stick in the mud? Are we going to keep up with our dynamic industry or not? Come on, James, help me out.
I think it's very difficult we are smallish organizations compared to the size of the industries we regulate. So it's very difficult to keep up. But I think if we can be outcome based rather than prescriptive, then I think that gives us more of a scope to keep up. And then again, because we are smallish compared to the size of the industry and the AI world in general, I think we need to work with others, work with our international partners within our countries, the AI ecosystem, and harness the capability and capacity that they have, rather than trying to do it ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Brent, from a Canadian perspective.
Yeah, so I totally agree with what James just said. You know, outcomes-based approaches, I think, somewhat future-proof your regulations instead of having rules that you've identified that are prescriptive to meet identified risks that you identified at some point in the past, because you know you're setting out the outcomes that you're looking for the industry to meet, and as they get better, as they get more technologically advanced, then they actually have better tools to meet those outcomes as well. So I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record here, but I do think that we can harness that. We need to harness their capabilities to get to better outcomes when we're from a regulatory perspective as we work with them and as we regulate them.
And Anders, you can have the last word if you'd like it.
Then I'll apologize again for arriving late and say I agree with a lot of what has been said here. I think maybe more than AI, I think there are other things also with younger players. The difference between gambling with or without stakes, so to speak, different kind of gamblings and the different categories that might move too. So there are plenty of reason to listen to what is going on in the industry so we can find out how to regulate it in a sensible way. And thank you for inviting me to the panel.
It is a pleasure. Gentlemen, I think that is pretty much time. So my thanks to Phil, James, Dennis, Anders, and Brent for what has been a fun and informative discussion. I do hope that whoever's listening has enjoyed it. And I very much thank the IGSA for their cooperation in putting it together. Thank you very much indeed.